Well, again, welcome everyone. Wish you a happy pre-Hanukkah or Hanukkah itself for those further afield on the east. I wanted to talk about Rabbi Landau, known as the Noda B'Yehuda, born in 1793 in different, it's unclear exactly what country, but everything is part of. He was born in a place called Apta, but was famous as the chief rabbi of Prague. But he had a couple of very unique aspects to him, and what we'll get to is the final sort of putting together of his personality, which I think will impact the case that we'll talk about with connection to Hanukkah. So he died in 1793. He was born in 1713, but he was a really interesting figure in that he was a true Renaissance man. He had very, very significant impact both on the rabbinic and political spheres. He was both a rabbi and felt through his position as a communal leader in his rabbinate that it was important to be close and appropriate with the secular authorities. He was, they call it Karov LaShalton. He was, interestingly, a very important figure, not in politics itself, but in saying and arguing that it was important that Jewish leaders also develop a strong pull and connection in the broader affairs of the countries in which you live. And interestingly, it was purely because of he developed not only his Talmudic acumen, but he was well known as a peacekeeper. And this, we'll talk a little bit about how he got his job. He was well known as a peacekeeper in that he was very articulate, but also very nuanced and careful about the way to speak to people. Not just what you say, but how you say it and how you make people feel. He felt that was very important, and that served him very well in a couple of really important parts of his life, which we'll mention, as well as it made him a very good ambassador. He was a very good ambassador of the Jewish people to the secular authorities, especially in his years in Prague, because not only was he loquacious and charismatic, but he really had a good affect about him that could show a very nice and positive face for Jewish people, the leadership of the Jewish people, and that served him very well. So he, however, besides that, he was not afraid to speak his mind on controversial issues. So, for example, one area where he was not a peacekeeper was the nascent years of the Hasidic movement, and he generally was opposed to Hasidism. And I'm just mentioning that because of what we talked about in the past and the last couple of weeks, where he felt that it was a new stream, so to speak, that was too far afield from the technical, Shas and Poskim Judaism that he was so as comfortable with, and so he was not a big fan of Hasidism. That being said, and this is a fascinating thing, he is one of the very often quoted sources in many Hasidic communities, especially Chabad. Chabad actually, quotes him very often. It was said that he had a relationship with the Baal HaTanya, the works of the Roshneir Zalman of Liadi, the first Chabad, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, and who was also a great Talmud Chacham who wrote a Shulchan Aruch, who wrote a halachic work. So that sort of connected the two of them. And while there were certain parts of Hasidism that the Noda B'Yehuda opposed, Rabbi Landau opposed, there were other areas where he recognized the scholarship and importance of the leaders of that community and the members of that community and interacted with them as such. So he, again, in many ways was a very nuanced person. He grew up and was what they like to say, he was a child progeny. He was a young Ilui. At the age of 13, he graduated, so to speak, to the top of the cheder. And in his very young years, he made his way to be a Rav in a city Let me just make sure I have my notes here. So he was a rav in a city called Yampol, Yampol, and I just have it here exactly where that is. But it was not a particularly large area. It's I believe right now in Ukraine. I'm not sure exactly, what the country it was in at what point, but right now it's in Ukraine, and it was a city that had a sizable and appropriate community. However, it was a city that allowed him a chance to be a rav of a city, but also to write. And he wrote significantly and was a source of a lot of people, hearing about him and writing questions to him. And it got him his jumping off point to one of the most prestigious rabbinates in the European world, which is, of course, the Rabbinate of Prague. How did that happen? So it's a really interesting story in that he was not as well known, not particularly well known. He was a well-known rabbi, but not like the top tier, so to speak, of the people known in the generation. And he was very young. But there was a conflict brewing in the major issue of the day. What's the major issue of the day? It was called Sabbateanism. Sabbateanism refers to the following of Shabtai Tzvi. Shabtai Tzvi was, we've actually talked about him in previous talks, a figure who commanded a very, very large following early on. He essentially created a messianic narrative of him as the Mashiach. And during a time where things were pretty miserable for a lot of people, they latched on to him. It didn't end well. If those of you know the story of Shabtai Tzvi, it ended in him converting to Islam and back and forth. And it was really a very sad chapter in Jewish history. But the Sabbatean movement, the Sabbatean Messianic movement, had a tremendous number of adherents. It had a lot of people who latched onto it. And what we come into, sort of the place that we're jumping into history, is in the aftermath of the main thrust of where there were Sabbateans. But what arose in the aftermath of the Sabbatean movement was a culture of what I'll call Jewish McCarthyism, meaning it was a concern and suspicion of everybody being a Sabbatean. Particularly, there was a couple of new innovations that became, they were things that exist for a long time, but became associated and connected with them. Most famously was Kabbalah or Kabbalistic or mystical study that sometimes was, so to speak, on the up and up, and other times dabbled and connected to a lot of the Sabbateanism. And there were a lot of people worried, if you're being too Kabbalistic or you're spending too much time in mystical studies, it may be that you are this, a Sabbatean. And more particularly, it had to do with the concept of kameos, kameot. You've heard the term. The term is a Hebrew term, but it's translated as amulets, A-M-U-L-E-T, amulets. It's a very common thing that people felt was full of zichut. It was merit. You could say superstition, luck, the positive, whatever it may be, however you translate. But it was a very, very powerful force in those days. You would get a blessing from somebody, you'd get an amulet from somebody, and the concept still exists today. And a big part of what was common for those in sort of spiritual authority was to write amulets for people. And they would have all sorts of mystical writings in them, and you would wear them, or you'd have these amulets, and they were meant to bring bracha, so to speak.
Like a mezuzah.
And I'm sorry?
Like a mezuzah.
Well, right. So a mezuzah, and that's part of a mezuzah, is it is commanded by the Torah, and it has a specific text. The concept of the mezuzah that is associated with bringing bracha and good luck to the home is in the merit of the mitzvah you are performing by doing the mitzvah of mezuzah. God will give positive, bracha on the home. The amulets went a step further. It's not a mitzvah to wear an amulet. It has nothing to do with a mitzvah. It's that it contains all sorts of texts of whatever they may be. And that is meant to conjure up certain forces that independently offer, good vibes, good positive things to the wearer of that amulet. And during a time where there was a tremendous amount of, sort of mystical discussion and you might say superstition, this was a very, very powerful, social phenomenon. Now, the reason why this was important in Jewish life was because it created one of the most controversial, again, almost civil wars, of which we'll talk about a bunch, between two very famous rabbinic figures. One was Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, and one was Rabbi Yaakov Emden. And both of whom were unequivocally considered or thought of as great rabbinic leaders and sages. However, there was a massive argument between the two of them. So much so that it really spilled over to much more than just a halachic discussion, but ended up really being almost a conflict between the two of them. So what happened was that the argument between them were because there was a that was raised by Rav Yaakov Emden against Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz, that Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz was writing amulets for people. It actually was a good parnasa, often people would pay for it. He was writing amulets for people, and here's this great rabbi who is world-renowned, world-class Talmid Chacham, who's writing these amulets, and Rav Yaakov Emden said, this is smacks of Sabbateanism. And we think that he is a closet Sabbatean. And so they, Rav Yaakov Eibeshitz responded, no, it's not true, and they had this massive, again, almost all-out war between them. And of course, Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz got stuff and said, absolutely, I'm not a Sabbatean, I don't believe in any of this stuff. What happened was that this young rabbi from this small town named Rabbi Cheskel, our hero, so to speak, jumped into the fray and was able to somehow navigate what was seen as the most intractable machlokas, intractable argument between two factions in the Jewish people, the followers of Yaakov Emden and Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz, to be able to try and find a way. And essentially, what he suggested was that they not have a ban against Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz. However, they should be put in Geniza, put away all these potentially problematic amulets that were written, and that somehow would calm the waters. Interestingly, the story went on further than that, because he says, well, if they're not a problem, why are you making them hide them? And he said, well, I'm hiding them because so there wouldn't be a problem. He's not great. He's a wonderful rabbi. In fact, spoke at his funeral and gave a strong hesped to him. Then later changed his mind and he was worried. But the interesting thing here is that his role as this peacemaker or attempted peacemaker between these two warring factions, Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz and Rav Yaakov Emden, caught the eye of the higher level, I would call rabbi recruiters. It caught the eye of the recruiters. So he got his first position as a rabbi at age 20. And, he rose. And before long, even as a very, very young man, he was approached to be the rabbi in Prague. Now, he wasn't 100% sure about it, but he was an established Talmid Chacham already, took the position, and immediately jumped into machlokas, as soon as at the very beginning of his tenure as the rabbi in Prague, which he was a rabbi a significant time, and he had a son who followed in his footsteps. But there was a major argument as soon as he showed up in town, because basically there were already, it was known as Nir Ve'em B'Yisrael. It was like the capital of Jewish Europe. And there were already significant great sages, Talmidei Chachamim, in town, many of whom were humble and said, wow, it's great that we're hiring this young, charismatic, energetic, erudite rabbi. And there were those who felt like, who is this whippersnapper? And so the story of the first part of his career in Prague is a fascinating one. And it's interesting. I'm not sure exactly what the mazel is, but the story of his first days in Prague, ended up being a classic story repeated in Chabad liturgy. Why, I don't know. But there are several times where the Chabad Rebbe's would quote this story about Rav Yecheskel Lender, about the Noda B'Yehuda. So what happened was, he showed up, and while there were many Talmidei Chachamim that were very significant, there were those who felt that they were smarter than he was, and who is he to be their rabbi? Who is he to be the rabbi in town? So they devised a plan. And the plan they devised was when he would give a speech, they would ambush him. And they would have a whole long list of questions to try, as they call gotcha questions of all sorts of deep and intricate halachot. There's actually a Gemara that parallels this, where there was a rabbi they wanted to sort of check if he's really on the up and up. He talked about Masechet Uktzin, which is like one of these really intricate and difficult tractates. So the same kind of thing happened here, where he's giving his drasha, he's giving his speech, and they're peppering him with these questions, almost to the border of chutzpah, that they're asking all these questions to try and essentially trip him up. And the questions are coming fast and furious. And what's fascinating is that he answers every single one correctly. Every single one correctly. He gets them all right. And then they ask him one other question, a whole complicated, convoluted case. You do this, and what happens with that? You do this and that. And he got it wrong. I mean, not just wrong, like there was one nuance that he missed. He absolutely and clearly, objectively got the question wrong.
That's not. It's okay if I continue.
And
Thank you.
the whole crowd, right? The whole crowd is like, what happened here? How did he get it wrong? Who did we really hire? And the people start saying, maybe we shouldn't have him as the rabbi. What's going on? Why are we listening to him? And all of the riffraff, so to speak, start to saying, oh, we got this question wrong. You didn't know. We got the halacha wrong. What happened? So let me share with you a very interesting take on this story. Give me a second. I'm going to read it. We'll read it in Hebrew, but I'll translate it as we read it in English, exactly what happened. This is actually from a Chabad, and this is what I know it's used often, a Chabad mamar, sort of a text where they talk about him, again, even though he personally was opposed to Hasidism in many ways. All right, so take a look at what happened. This was the story with the Noda B'Yehuda. That was his nickname because of the book he wrote. Sha'aluhu she'elot shonot. They asked him all sorts of different questions. V'hichlitu merosh, and the agitators decided ahead of time, if he answers them all correctly, so wonderful, great, he's the good guy. But if they catch him with anything that he doesn't answer correctly, they shall proclaim that he's a good enough rabbi on the Yampol level, on the small town level, but not for us, big, fancy, big shots in Prague. No, he's not high level enough for us. Hashem so one time, so to speak, as if God helped them succeed, that they tested over a certain period of days, they successfully tripped him up. And he got it wrong. Lachshil means from the word like fail. He failed the exam, so to speak. He got it wrong. So everybody said, what's going on? Listen to his explanation. Fascinating, because he had this such in touch with what the depth of it was. And he had the very powerful faith because of it. His beer, he explained, Pesher ha'uvda utmua. He says he didn't deny that he got right. You know what? They showed him, oh no, if you look here and here and here, you got this answer wrong. He says, I know. I didn't. Thank you for showing me. I appreciate it. And he explained, she'etzlichu lachshilo b'dvar halacha. He says, yeah, you correct. You got me wrong. I got it wrong in this halachic issue. He says, shekanira she'ela hayta teoretit v'lo ma'asit. Because you know why? I know, because you guys made up this shaila and it wasn't actually a real case. You totally made it up. They presented it as if somebody had asked the shaila, that they had this situation where they needed to know if something's kosher or not. It's like you made it all up. You made it all up. It wasn't a real question. Klomar, be'etzem midrash hezber, ech nitan letzapot, basar v'dam yiftok b'dinei Torah. He says, because if you think about it, listen to the humility and the brilliance in his answer. He said, how is it that a rabbi ever can answer a question about the Torah? The Torah is infinite wisdom, right? The Torah is this godly thing, and we're made out of flesh and blood, right? Even if, the greatest rabbi, he threw in facetiously, Filu Rabbah Shel Prague, Baal Rosh Tov, even the great rabbi in Prague, right? How could he truly be able to grasp the infinite nature of the wisdom of the Torah? Kasher Yishnei, especially Yishnei Yeredat Torah, over time, we're right? Ella Hisbira to Behuda. He says, Mikevan Sheminuyav Nasal Pitorah. Since you have this appointment that is meant to come from the Torah, so to speak, it's because you have been given this awesome responsibility to lead the people that is guided by the Torah, then, so basically, whenever you ask a shaila to a rabbi, you're asking him basically, can you guide us what godly wisdom is about this and this shaila? Now, how is the human being able to do that? So clearly, it's when he is God, he is in the position that the Torah wants him to be in. So God helps him. And yeah, God, there's a help from above that God says, oh, you know what? They're asking you about what my will is. Here, let me give you some assistance to say the right answer about what the halacha should be. All right, because Kadesh lo lachshila Israel. So if it's not to make sure the Jewish people follow the right path, God's going to help the rabbi give the right answer. He says, however, when it's a question that is purely theoretical, that is not meant to actually guide anybody about what to do, but essentially it's just made to be a defense mechanism for the rabbi's covet, well, then you don't get any help from above. If I didn't get help from above, I return to just being a basar madam. I'm a human being. And human beings get things wrong. That was his answer to them. He essentially said, you know why I got the question wrong? Because every other time where I answer a question about the halacha, I am getting assistance from God giving me the ability to answer that question. When it's not a real question, God has no reason to assist me. So that's why I got it wrong. Which is, I think, just such a brilliant and fascinating, analysis and thought, which was it put the naysayers in Prague in their place, so to speak. That even this young whippersnapper was actually, of the caliber to serve as their rabbi, and indeed he was a very, very successful rabbi in Prague. The unique aspect of the role that he played was that at the same time as he was humble, he was exceedingly confident. Meaning he was not afraid to say his opinion. He wrote prolifically and was not afraid of anybody who would be, to say what he thought was the case. And perhaps the most famous examples of this was the story of the Get of Cleves. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of this story of the Get of Cleves. We'll read it a little bit together. It's just a crazy story. And it was one of these other shilas that essentially created a civil war. And he was caught up in it, but felt that it was appropriate for him to respond and talk about it, or to have an opinion on the real, famous issues of the day. So let's see if we can share the story here. Give me one moment. Let me see if I can make sure I get the right thing here. Here we go. Okay, so let's listen to this story of the crazy story of the Get of Cleves. And it actually, interestingly, ended up being one of the legal foundations for a very interesting concept called the insanity plea, right? Which my father always reminds me, just to digress for a moment, of the great Marx Brothers line, where they have a clause in a contract where it says that if somebody should be not of sound mind, then this contract is null and void. And one says to the other, it's called the sanity clause. And the other responds, there ain't no sanity clause. And that joke works better when we're all in person and we can laugh at it. Okay, so the story goes as follows. Let's see here. 1776. There was a bacher, a boy named Itzik. 1766, and he had a shidduch with a girl. Her name was Leah Bat Yaakov Gunzenhuizen, and she was from a city called Bonn, B-O-N-N, in Germany. He was from Mannheim, also a German city, and they set the date for the wedding, 8th of Elul of that particular year. And the wedding took place in the Chassan's city, which is interesting. The next they met, and the mother of the Chassan, Imoshe al-Chatan, hutrida mimatzav rucho. He was nervous about his state of mind. Shalauto matzav hagam koshu. Right? Have you, in your betrothed, in your bride, have you found some problem? He says, no, I just am worried about all the financial issues of the wedding. That's what bothers me. Okay. And in fact, when the wedding exact happened, they seen that the chassan was not really into it. They were noting his unusual state of mind. However, he seemed to be able to function. On the Wednesday, which weddings generally happened on Wednesdays back then, the wedding happened, and he spoke, and he ate in the thing. The next morning, the chassan took the money from the dowry, picked up And without telling anybody, he just left town. Totally absconded. He didn't say anything. Finally, on Sunday, they looked and looked and looked, and they found him in the next town over. He had the money there, but he, was people were starting to get more and more worried. What kind of thing? He ran away. And they caught him, and they said he fainted. When he woke up from his faint, he said, "I have this terrible fear for my life. We must leave. Must leave." Things calmed down for a few days, and he started again. He's got to get out of here. He's got these fears, these paranoias. He's got to get out of here. So they said, you know what? Let's move. Let's go back to the woman's family's town. And they went back to Bonn. And in the middle of Sheva Brachos, finally Sheva Brachos ended. And he said, and the chassan says, I just can't do this anymore. I'm too fearful and scared, and this isn't working. I want a divorce. He says it at the end of the Sheva Brachos. He wants a divorce at the end of the Sheva Brachos. Why? Because I'm in such great danger. I must leave and go to London. That's what he said. So the family was like, this isn't going so well. And they agreed that there should be a get. There wasn't a town there, so it wasn't a Beis Din there. So they ended up in a place called Cleves, which is a border town on the edge, on the western edge of Germany. And in Cleves, they wrote this get. And he says, I need to write this. I don't want her to be an aguna. But within this whole discussion, there were, obviously all of these things have financial arrangements, and the financial arrangements were very favorable to the bride's family. Again, it was in her town, it was her impetus that the get was, in her sort of sphere that the get was being written. And he had this get, and he runs away to London. The boy's family hears about this, especially the fact that all of the money was transferred to her family, and they say, we're not having none of this. And it ended up being this massive, massive saga of whether or not they could invalidate the get. Invalidate the get because it was written when he was insane, when he wasn't of sound mind. He violated the sanity clause. All right. And it became the celebrated discussion in the city of Frankfurt. And there was 2 letters written by a Polish rabbi who died. There was like all this crazy stuff. And sort of your bona fides in the Jewish world depended on how you paskined on the Get Cleves, on how you viewed the story of the Get of Cleves. And in fact, it laid the foundation for, again, the insanity defense, etc. So the rabbis in Frankfurt specifically took a very strong stance on this story of the Get Cleves. And the Noda B'Yehuda, the Rabbi Cheskel, the person we're talking about, made a very strong statement. And he was not afraid of saying his opinion, and in the issue of the get of Klieg, he felt that the get is valid. The woman should go get married, and the rabbis of the city of Frankfurt essentially said, "We want to revoke your smicha because of that psak, because of that ruling." So it was this massive thing, and he knew what the stakes were, and he said his opinion anyway. As a side point, by the way, fascinating end of the story of the Get of Cleves, where the husband somehow calmed down, decided he really wanted to be married to her, came back. They did a ceremony that I don't think has ever been done before, where the husband gave her a ring and said, "With this ring, you're still married to me." So it was like an act, it was like a wedding ceremony. It's sort of like us renewing our vow. It was a wedding ceremony, but he thought that the get was no good, so they were still married all along. So he says, with this ring, I hereby remain married to you like we've always been married to Moshe Yisrael. There was like a wedding ceremony that changed and skipped all the wedding ceremony part. But anyway, this was one of those things where he very much waded into very strong political waters. Another really interesting thing was that Rabbi Yechezkel Landau in 1789 sent a decree, and this you'll be very surprised to hear, that the Jewish boys should enlist in the Kaiser Franz Joseph's army. Very unusual. He felt that this was the right thing to do in that country at that time, to have that civic engagement, and therefore he supported joining the army. At the same time, he also did other things that were in his community very unpopular. For example, he made a hard and fast decree: no big chasanas. You can't have these big weddings, because he felt that they were going to be too much of a financial drain, and it was too much keeping up with the Joneses. So he said you can't have big fancy weddings. And you know, over the years, there have been many different people who have tried to accomplish that in a variety of different contexts. I guess COVID is one of the first times in our lifetime that it may have succeeded, but that was one of the innovative rulings of Rabbi Yechezkel Landau. Okay, so just to recap, we've seen a lot of different aspects of his humility at the same time as his keen intellect and his lack of fear. He wasn't scared of saying groundbreaking opinions. Now, that all leads up to this shaila, which has to do with Hanukkah, where a woman comes to Rabbi Yechezkel Landau and she asks the following. You may have heard this from me before, and we'll try and see it in a little bit of a different context. She comes to Rabbi Yechezkel Landau, who's at that time the chief rabbi of Prague, and she comes to him and she says, "Rabbi, I've got a shaila." She talked about, and you may remember this from a different time we mentioned. She says, "I have one pot in my house. I only have one pot, and this pot is my fleishik pot. That's what I use for Shabbos. My fleishik pot. I'm sorry, my milchik pot." He says, I don't have much money to ever have any fleishik food, so this is my milchik pot. However, for in honor of Hanukkah, I was given some schmaltz, some fat, some schmaltz. And I was given some schmaltz to make special, Hanukkah food. And the schmaltz is, of course, animal fat. It's, of course, fleishik. She says, by accident, I threw the schmaltz into my milchik pot. So I have my milchik pot, and on the fire, it's cooking some schmaltz. So there's now, meat, right? The schmaltz is meat. It's fleishik. And it's now mixed together with milk from the milchik pot. She says, "Rabbi, what do I do?" So the rabbi starts to say, "Oh, well, it's a problem, the meat and milk together." She's like, no, I'm not asking about anything. I'm not asking about the pot. I'm not asking about I'll tell you what I'm asking. She says, "Do you know what I'm asking? I'm asking, can I use the congealed schmaltz as my Hanukkah candle?" Think about this. She says, fat is flammable. I'll take a little piece of cotton. I'll stick the cotton into the schmaltz, and I'll light it. And that will serve as my Hanukkah candle. That's what she says. So the rabbi, Rabbi Yechezkel Landau, says, you've asked me a phenomenal question. This is a deep shaila. This is a truly great shaila. And the answer is yes. You can do it, no problem. You can use it for your Hanukkah candle. And he then, raised this in the shir. And he was telling the people in town, he was giving the shir. And some of the people in the shir said, 1 second, Rabbi. Are you so sure she can use that as her Hanukkah candle? And they raised the following 2 objections. They said, first of all, when you light the wick, right? When you light the wick, what is that going to be doing? That's going to come down, and the wick, as you know, when the fire goes down the wick, right? Then it lights the fuel, in this case, the schmaltz, right? The fat. And that schmaltz has milk and meat together in it, right? That's what just happened. And since it has meat and milk together in it, well, there's one of the rules of kosher is you're not allowed to cook meat and milk together. And this flame, this wick, is essentially cooking meat and milk together. So they said, you should tell her she's not allowed to use it. And the second issue they said to him was, Rabbi, are you so sure? One of the prohibitions of milk and meat together is you're not allowed to have benefit from it. So, if you're using it for your candle, you are benefiting from milk and meat that were cooked together. So you should have told her she's not allowed to use it. She's not allowed to use the Hanukkah candle from the schmaltz. This is a classic shaila asked to the Rabbi Yehuda. It was actually recently delved into again in a later tshuvas of David Cohen, a contemporary posek, but it was an interesting debate. And here comes what the Rabbi Yehuda said. 2 are the halacha, and 1 I'd call the inspiration from halacha. He said, well, he didn't back down from the questions that were asked him. He says, let's take them one by one. You say that it's a problem to cook meat and milk together, right? And why? How do you say that's happening? Because when you have the schmaltz and the wick, and the flame goes down, the flame will come near some milk and meat together from this, that is this mixture of milk and meat, and that will violate the laws of cooking milk and meat together. He says, though, that isn't considered cooking milk and meat together. Do you know why? Because as we learn from the laws of Shabbos, ein bishul achar bishul, which means that it is not considered cooking something unless they're cooking for the first time. Which is why on Shabbos, you're not allowed to cook, but you're allowed to reheat food using a blech. So he used the same concept as the blech to essentially say, you aren't cooking meat and milk together in this Hanukkah candle of yours. You are reheating milk and meat together. Now, does that mean you can cook a cheeseburger? No, even though the cheese was sort of already, made and the meat, because the idea is that cooking meat and milk together is like the shidduch, the first time they meet. But if they've already been cooked, cooled down, congealed, and now you want to cook it again, that's not a violation of cooking meat and milk together. He said, okay, what about the second issue you raised? Are you allowed to have benefit from this mixture of milk and meat? And again, he said, what does benefit mean? Benefit means you're not allowed to have a monetary money. You can't gain money from milk and meat together, right? It's a big, we once, I think, discussed, can you own stock in a non-kosher restaurant? Depending on what that non-kosher restaurant serves and what your ownership stake is, are you gaining benefit from milk and meat that are cooked together, right? But he says it's not monetary benefit, and it's not physical benefit. You're not eating it. You're not getting nutrients or nutrition from it. What are you gaining? You're gaining a mitzvah. And there's a famous rule, mitzvos lav lehenos nitnu. Mitzvot, gaining a mitzvah is not considered the kind of benefit that is a violation of the rules of basar v'chalav, of milk and meat, of kasher. So this came from a shaila that he answered, and then got attacked about it, and he fielded the questions and attacks on him with aplomb. But he says, do you know what? I had to think a lot about how to answer your issues, but I knew that this woman could use the schmaltz for her Hanukkah candle. Do you know why? Because if she's coming to me so poor that she can't afford to buy regular Hanukkah candles, and she needs to use leftover, discarded, problematic schmaltz, because that's the only thing she can afford to light on Hanukkah, then, again, he says, I have that siyata d'shmaya that I know that she's able to do it. And it turns out he was right. He says, I gave it some thought, but immediately I told her, yes, she could do it. Because he said that's that exact thing of that concept that he felt that he needed to have that personal empathy. That was what got him his job, the personal empathy of the Rav Yaakov Emton, Shona Tzanaibis's saga, and that he had the humility to say, I'm a human being and I'm going to make mistakes. But he truly felt that in his role as that guide and the rabbi, his job was to be there and to be God's emissary, so to speak, in terms of sharing the chachma of Hashem with the world, the wisdom of God with the world. And he says, God's got to help me do that. And so when it was a fake question, he got it wrong sometimes. But when here was somebody, a real human being in real suffering, standing in front of him, desperately wanting, with the meager things she had to fulfill the mitzvah of Hanukkah, he absolutely knew right away that she could do it, and in fact used a brilliant analysis to come to that conclusion. So I just, again, that the halacha is the halacha, but is also the inspiration of the kind of humanity that was behind the way he approached his rabbin and his position, that ended up getting to, I think, a beautiful result of an inspiring Hanukkah that at least this woman had, and I think that we, B'ezrat Hashem, will have as well. So with that, I want to wish everybody a wonderful and happy Hanukkah, and that we should be able to enjoy together many, many Yamim Tovim and many happy times. Habayim Aleinu L'Tovah.